All right. Good morning, friends. This is our, I think, second post-build stream. Um, so today we have a few issues that we want to go over. Like it's mostly things that are blocking forward progress in other areas. So we start with the require method impl to remain in effect. Don, do you want to talk about it?
Yeah, I guess I can. So basically, the new have this feature called covariant return types, where you can have a class where you have returning some type and have a derived class that has right for that method, but returns a type that's derived from the original type that was returning. So, so one example is that you have, say, class A where a func instance of A, when you have class B, where you have override of the returning instance of B, for example, and it allows you to cast in the when you know you are using the derived class. And this attribute is a something that the Sharp compiler to mark such the methods that override the base class methods kernel, and it's not something that the users would add to the compiler.
So maybe I missed the nuance, but like, isn't that already legal in IL? Like, why do we need an attribute for?
This attribute allows the runtime understand that it needs to that the override to remain in effect. Here's an example. Let's see. You can scroll down a little bit. Where have this. It's almost at the end where you have this example. I mean. Yeah. So you have the class A, have class B, and then you have a class C that overrides method in the sort of virtual function. This attribute needed for the runtime to properly handle the the virtual overriding. So the virtual resolution method resolution would the correct method.
Are they not regular overrides? Because there's also
These are the overrides. Basically, they are not overrides. They are new slots in the virtual table that override methods in the like in the base classes in different. You can do this if you DIL if you apply this dot override thing, then you can override other methods from the base class. So you can say that this method the method overrides some method from the base class. It has to be used for the covariant return because regular overrides allow just basic standard overriding, same type, same signature, same return type, and same name. While this override allows change the return type to basically work with covariant return.
right. So then that's different from the normal like new and override semantics in C# where you can basically say override or give me a new slot. But basically this is saying I'm occupying the same vtable slot as the guy over there.
This is basically saying it's kind of in the effect that it creates a new slot, but the writes from the base class. So basically, if you then invoke something using the base class, then some method this then the override will be called even though it's a bot.
So why is the attribute?
Yeah.
It's the thing I'm trying to figure out as well.
Yeah, I just inherited. I am not that good in the runtime actually. Yeah, that might be better for David to be here because he would give you the correct answer to why it's that. But basically this
Is even if it's making slots so that it can have a different return type, seems like that's a public slot on an type in the way. The only time
it's not
away would happen.
it's not for JIT, it's for runtime. When we do the virtual function resolution, we could end up solving somehow. I think that we could end up resolving the method from the if you call using the B class, then I mean if you call the virtual method the B class, then without it at runtime would call function on class because right of the A, and this attribute says that the should apply to the other to the B class as well. So basically, virtual function would then call the override in this if you if you have object class.
Yeah, so basically what it says is like if you apply this attribute on a method that has an override specification, then it means apply to this one and any of the base types in the hierarchy that have an override on the same method as well.
Yeah.
Interesting. And the normal override is literally just this one thing.
I know this is complex and
I mean, it makes sense. I mean, my question, I mean, I think this is the generic one that we always ask, like, does it have to be an attribute, or I guess the method impl flags are, there's only so many of them. You don't want to put it there, but it seems like
I wasn't there when you tried it. So was agreement between the C# team and the runtime folks that were originally discussing that. I can try to see if there is any like reasoning recorded anywhere.
I mean, if I had to guess, I don't think the C# team cares one way or the other. They just care about what they're supposed to emit, so long the semantics are the ones. I think if we say that's a flag somewhere on an existing one, they're also fine with that. I guess it's more a question for the runtime/DPE format itself, whether method impl flags would work for that as well. But I guess versioning that is always a pain in the ass. I think they asked this.
Yeah, let me see if I have. I was. I try to find my email just quickly. I can.
What is the semantic? Do you know the semantics of this thing for if I now create a new type called D that extends B and also overrides virtual function? Does the compiler then also apply the attribute, the override in D, or is the fact that C has this attribute applied that's the only thing in the hierarchy that
It should be applied to the.
but it has to be applied by the compiler, right? Like there's no
Yes.
implicit inheritance.
I'm not 100% clear about the details. trying to give the discussion mentions that. I was joined too late, so I can't see the reasoning about that.
Yeah, I mean, like we can just collect the questions and then give it back. I mean, like to me, the desired semantics makes sense how IL works. I'm not sure the name makes a lot of sense to me. Like, it seems a bit abstract for my taste. Seems like what we want to say is kind of like reserve overrides of base or like closer to based on how I understand. Um, Other than that, I think like the namespace makes sense. That's usually where we put stuff that only the compiler is supposed to use. We don't expect humans to actually reason about this name anyway. But of course, people will see it in, the disassembly view. So we should at least make sure that the name somewhat sense to people.
Yeah, I think the name is. I said yeah, it's bad that I don't know why it was picked. Whether there were like some others considered or. Yeah, because when Fadi has left, I just inherited this thing like 3 weeks ago or something like that. I wasn't trying to figure out why this was.
Totally fine. So then let's just.
I think a little bit up in the text is that the, the reason it's that this is to ensure that any virtual call to the method, whether it's the base signature or derived signature of the method, always is derived over what we basically said before. All right, so what would be the next step with that? Should try to explain or try to find a better one, or
So the way it normally works is we just pose a bunch of questions, we flip it back to API needs work, and then basically what would be good if we would have somebody who is basically picking up Fadi's work and is able to speak to the thing in more detail and like basically shepherd it through the process. I think most of the stuff seems fine. I mean, like again, like it seems like the namespace is right. Having it as an attribute seems likely the right choice. I will still ask, but I think I know the answer to that already. Um, and yeah, I think again, the C# compiler team probably won't care whatever the name is. If this is the name, they will encode that one. If we tell them it's a different name, they encode that one. So I think that's fine. That have to be an attribute. Attribute. Anybody else? Any additional feedback, Jeremy?
I'm basically just still confused why it's needed because it sounds like without it, it does exactly what I think the runtime does. Ending that runtime behavior would didn't have it. Essentially, that'll help? What is it changing about the run?
well, yeah, I mean, description in this issue, I think that it tries to explain that like step by step way, but yeah, I don't want to like. I guess you have more stuff, so I will just by like slowing you down by trying to fully understand and reinterpret what's here. I don't know. Would it make sense? Some other thing that you have to review, and I just like look through that again, and I can gather some like more detailed explanation.
I mean, it would probably help to have that. I think I have a hunch of how this is working, but it would probably still help to have more detail there. I mean, as Jeremy said, like the general problem with these features is often that depending on how they actually work, one shape might work better than the other, and it's a bit hard to judge that without knowing exactly what it does.
Like it's describing that it's variant returns, but everything here is a void function that takes no parameters. So
Yeah, that's weird.
I can't map concepts from one to the other.
And then calling the function virtual function and using dot override. And I think it would be better if it was virtual and if it used override like normal C# syntax. And if there's a case of where like the C virtual function is writing a dot virtual can't currently express in today, it would help. It would help explain, like maybe use interface implementation syntax to indicate you're overriding a dot virtual here. Because I think my understanding is that it's a dot virtual and then b dot new virtual function c virtual or override a dot virtual, which means you've got c overriding a and b is a new not being.
The thing is, it's not really new because if I understand correctly, if you called instance of a, then you end up calling the virtual function from a. Only if you use it with b and derived classes, you end up calling the virtual function if you use the new syntax. While this means if the b overrides a, it basically replaces the body by the function. So basically, if you call a the virtual function, you end up calling this b.
Right, which would just be standard.
Yeah, this case it is. That's true that the return types would be better here, like different return types to explain behavior. I think that that was meant rather to explain why the itself is needed rather than try to do. So maybe Vadi, when he was writing this, want to like mix in more detail on the actual covariant return. But I'm just
because I mean, for me, where it's like, oh, and C now has 3 entries in a V table, and as far as I can tell, there should only all the parts where it's like, oh, the V table got fatter. Why? So it's supposed to be A's returning A, B's back to return A, returning C. Like, I don't understand when the new plots are popping up and what the attribute, what the runtime would do.
I think the way I understand it is because of the way IL works, covariant returns are not a thing in IL. So if you want to have a different return type, you have to have a new slot for the new signature. But then you need to patch up the other ones to point to the new one as well, so that you have the right semantics. And the way I understand this attribute is what this attribute does is it basically tells the runtime to say, well, I haven't really patched up all my base calls, so please do that for me. Oh, sorry, I haven't patched up all the overrides in the base, potentially, so you have to do this for me.
Right, but if because the part that confuses B's override of A's virtual function. It says call this function that has the same name but a different return type. Call slot 1. I don't understand where any future patching is. E has now overridden A's thing to say call slot 1. And then C does whatever, and calling slot 0 that says return call slot 1.
But the C overrides it overrides the slot with its slot overrides the slot 0. So the base class function would inherit C in this world, C virtual function.
Right, but wouldn't that just be a requirement on the compiler to write down the A, that it's overriding A's version and points to the D version, and then B's version and points to the C version? Like, sounds like a compiler problem.
Well, I think the
unless we're
problem
trying
is
to
you can't
simplify the
express that, I think, in compile time.
But the IL you get the call to the full method signature with return type. I understand IL.
Well, I think the reason
you can't express this in C#, you can express it in L.
Yeah, so I think the problem is that, so if you look at C, right? So C extends from B. The thing you're overriding is basically like the original definition is effectively a virtual function, right? And I think there's no way you can express this in IL to say, I want this thing to override A and B's virtual. I think that might be the problem, and so that's why
they are two slots, and you basically by this override both.
Yes,
effectively.
And I think that's the part you can't express about the attribute.
Name is
I
it doesn't
agree.
necessarily state that, and it's not clear how that would if you've got multiple disparate overrides. What if it has to override 3 or 4? Is the default behavior overrides all?
Yeah, I think the idea of the attribute is that you preserve the entire hierarchy, right? But yeah, that's the other thing where I think having more detail would help, because that's the concern I have as well, that I understand how this works for this case. I'm not entirely sure how that works for all cases. And if you eventually want an attribute that can basically override part of it, I don't know whether the name makes a lot of sense here.
Override function overrides function in A, then this attribute means to be applied to like all the overrides of that the future. So in this case, it's like both A and B. If it's more, I mean, there is no stop to that. It's just like applying the override to, because the A was then overridden by a different slot, right? Wouldn't carry this information.
Right, but it sounds more like it's the purpose of the attribute override all compatible features, right? Like the require method impl to remain in effect. Title, I thought we were talking about the linker trimming feature. Like it sounds to me like it's don't delete, but it's not don't delete extra word. The name doesn't. If I understand, it sounds like copy some data from things that Tyler maybe didn't know about, but the as it really exists. But that doesn't sound anything like titles do. Maybe it makes sense to David because plumbing doesn't make sense to me from the outside the box.
Yeah, I understand. I think just one more. If it was not here, we would end up overriding the slot in of the A virtual function. So basically, you called using n of A, then you would get the right thing. If you called B, then it would call the B virtual. While we wanted to call the C function. That's the difference that would the attribute mean in this specific example.
Which currently sounds like it's lead to computation. What happens if he did the variant in a later version of the assembly, where does the attribute go, etc. It sounds very, very, very complicated. Attribute doesn't solving that complication. It sounds like it's like sort of patching over one piece of something that's never happened.
But
Yeah,
I mean,
sounds
that
like
might be the
David will like details on the like type system, because that's out of my like knowledge.
Yeah, if it was every covariant and it was like splat me to other signals, then I could understand it. But the fact that it's only a peer. Also, I don't know which one.
Yeah, it should be. It should have been applied. It's, I think, or this attribute should be on all the like. Yeah, and you are right. It's not clear whether the covariant is right or not. Yeah. Should be made more clear.
I added a few more questions at the bottom, so we're not entirely sure what this attribute does. The issue talks about covariant returns, but all samples use void. None of the methods use virtual functions. What are the behavior differences with and without the attribute? If this can't be explained in C, explain maybe the wrong word here, but this can be expressed in C#, then Ids and would help too. The name seems a bit abstract. Can we make this clearer, like preserve overrides attribute or preserve base overrides attribute? Does it have to be a new attribute, or could it be a new flag? How does this attribute play with default interface methods, and how does this play with versioning where overrides are added to the middle of the hierarchy later? Did I miss anything, or is that it?
I think if I had answers to all, it would be a lot less confusing.
My gut feel is once we have answers to all these questions, we might be even more confused. I'm not sure. It sounds like it's a complicated feature.
Perhaps.
So how does it? When say David answers those questions, there will be another round of
so like depends on what the answers are, but my gut feel is probably his one-line comment will probably not help us, so we probably have to get him on next time. It would probably be helpful. So the next meeting we have is Thursday, so that would work.
Okay.
I can add you to that as well if you want.
I think that on Thursday I have like training, but David should. Well, I'll do it.
Sounds good. Alrighty, then the next one will take the remainder of this meeting, probably.
It's quick. No, really, I mean.
Remember, anything you say can and will be used against you.
Yeah. In summary, I mean, we have a logging, so you can have inside the and also, on the other hand, we have other tracing device is in the tracing context. But these two things is not related to each other at all. But we got some scenarios that some people need to relate the tracing context with the logging scoping. So basically, this all of this implementation should be internal. But I mean, to enable the relating the tracing context to the logging scoping, it will require like allocating some extra memories and like splitting more text to the logging and so on. So we prefer to have like opt-in behavior. I mean, like whoever need to relate the tracing context with the logging scoping, so they should opt in to that. I mean, it will not be the default behavior. This actually requirements came from ASP.NET and also App Insight, Azure logging, and this stuff. So basically, all proposed APIs here is just like how to opt in to get this, I mean, tracing context inside the logging scoping, and also to control what level of the tracing context you want to add to the logging. I mean, tracing scoping, tracing context contains something called trace ID, span ID, parent ID, and some state and some flags. So if you look to the example here, I'm about like, so the idea is to how to enable the trace context inside the logging is while you create the logging builder, we are introducing a new extension method on the builder itself. It's called configure. This is the same way, like the other logging stuff works. So we introducing the configure extension method on the builder, and inside this configure method, it will take a parameter which is, we call it a factory options. This is what we introduced in this proposed APIs. Yeah, and so basically, like while you create a factory and getting the builder, you configure the builder with the factory options, and you enable getting the activity tracking options, or the tracing context. So if you look to what is expecting to get in the logging, this is the next thing, which is start with info. Like you will get something like span ID, and you have a full span ID, you have trace ID, you'll get the trace ID, parent ID, and so on. So this is the whole idea about what we want to do here. So if you go down a little bit, we can start looking at the proposed APIs itself.
So
yeah,
in your maybe let's just go down all the way to this one here, to the extension method first. I guess logger factory options already exist.
No, this is what we are introducing.
Sorry, I mean the iLogging builder already exists.
Yeah, everything exists. The only new things we introducing here is logger factory options and the extension method and some enum flags. That's all thing.
So is the configure method, does it mutate the input, or does it return a distinct value as the return?
The configure method doesn't return anything. It just it just enables some options on the factory itself. So, and from these options, we can detect about so we will turn it on to get the trace context in the logging. So we will start using it.
To your question, Jeremy, it's a fluent pattern, so it's intended to return this parameter.
Yeah.
That way you can call .configure.
Yeah. That's good.
Okay.
This pattern is already well established within ASP.NET, so I don't think anyone is.
That's fair. Just in general, in the BCL, we don't do fluent. So
yeah.
So the question is this already being done in other .NET logging APIs? And if it's not being done in other .NET logging APIs, then we get to ask the big question of should we be doing it here? Where, in general, the answer is we don't like introducing new concepts.
Yeah, I think the ship has kind of sailed with the Microsoft
Yeah.
extensions APIs, because they basically behave like that already across the board.
Right. So if this is consistent within this area, then
Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, it's very consistent with this.
I mean, everything that I know about this feature is on the screen right now.
Yeah, this is part of the stuff that ASP.NET originally worked on that got kind of handed over the wall to the libraries team. Everything in Microsoft.extensions follows ASP.NET design patterns rather than standard BCL design patterns for the most part.
I mean, that's why it ended up being called Microsoft extensions, because neither side could agree with the other side. So that's kind of the compromise we landed.
So my easy first thing is you need to get rid of activity tracking options.default, because we had this with SSL protocols. We had default, and then when we needed to evolve it later, we were unable to do so because you can't change the value of an enum field. Instead, this should be something like a static read-only on logger factory options, so you have the flexibility of modifying the value in future releases.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I would even go a step further and say, just initialize the default in logger factory options constructor? Like, why do you?
Sure. If you need to expose what the default is, then it should be a static read-only somewhere instead of an enum member.
Sure. I mean, like, I would just say, like, if it's the default, like, just have it to be the default, right? Like, I mean,
it's fair.
But yeah, my other concern is like default on an enum is always weird when you also have none, because now the keyword default and the member default don't mean the same thing.
Does it help if we rename it instead of default something else? Or?
Well, the problem is it will if it's an enum member, it will always for the end of time be span ID, trace ID, and parent ID. Yeah. So the only good name for it is span ID, trace ID, and parent ID, because if there's a new thing in the next version that gets 0x20, you can't add that to default even if you really, really, really wanted to. Yeah. So you should not have the default member in the enum.
So we can introduce something static on logger factory options itself? I mean, like...
Right, so it's if you want something to express, like if it's expressing a preference, like a default, as opposed to it is an actual semantic combination of multiple flags, then a static read-only on some other type is better, because that means that it will use the value as defined in the current build as opposed to the value defined in the reference assembly that you compiled against.
Okay, but in the future, this static can be changed to different values?
As a static read-only, it can. As a enum member, it cannot. And as a const, it cannot.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, this is good feedback.
I mean, do you need it ever?
This is... actually, David Fuller is the one who requested this.
Yeah. I mean, maybe not. It just seems nice to expose what the actual default is, in case you want to set it or reset it to something else.
It's just that even if you do it, will people discover it, right? Because you can't put it on the actual enum.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't die on the hill for it, so I'm kind of like.
I mean, it seems to me like where like the place where you are most likely wanting to know what the default is in a place where you can access logger factory options already. In which case, just ask activity tracking options what its value currently is, and then do whatever you want to do with it. Like for example, let's say you want to enable, let's say you want to disable trace ID, right? You would just say, you know, activity tracking options equals activity tracking options, and then till the trace ID, right?
Yeah.
And that seems like the most sensible thing.
Okay, that's fair.
Yeah, that also fits with the fluent pattern more, because the idea is you're never overwriting someone in a fluent pattern. You're always building on top of what they do.
Right.
Well, you can overwrite, right?
You can, but it's not. I don't think it's that common. It's more common to chain, right?
Compose,
and Imo's example of, you know, value and equals tilde something is an example of chaining.
Okay.
All right.
That seems fine.
And let's do that, and then the rest makes sense to me.
Yeah, so for the logger factory class, I mean, this is already existing class, but we are adding some extra constructors that takes these options. And this is mainly to make dependency injection work nicely with the feature.
Yeah, this is the sucky part of DI. Well, it's not really DI. It's just a fact of having to evolve APIs that have constructors. When you add new things, you have to add more. Well, new required things is kind of the problem, right? So that's the issue here.
Who knew logger factory? Is that constructed by DI?
Yeah.
And so what happens now when you add these new constructors? How does ASP.NET decide which one to use?
The container by default picks up the longest. So that's kind of how it works. It can't be ambiguous either. So it has to be kind of the longest thing that has the most DI provided arguments.
In other words, the one that has the most arguments is only overloaded by arity then.
Right.
So that means if you have 5 arguments, that's the longest. You cannot have another thing that also has 5 arguments. Otherwise, DI will fail.
Correct.
And so by us adding, basically, I suppose the last one is the one you will now call, right?
Right.
Providers filter option.
Right.
The question for Emo is like, we need to deprecate some of old constructors now.
Yeah. So the issue is, so normally what we try to do is to have this not go crazy. Well, first of all, you can't add new required things because that's the crux of the issue, right? New required things make this a problem. We tend to deprecate older constructors, the ones that are less used, but that is also a problem if we want people to support newing up the factory. The reason it was this way is because people in the past, like before 3.0, would new up the factory by hand. Now we have the create helper that does this for you, but prior to that, you could do new factory and then call add provider on the fly. So I don't have a good answer for this. This is just like a side effect of wanting to constructor inject dependencies that come from a shared location.
Quick question.
Yep.
Quick question, David. Does the DI system support property injection or just constructor injection?
Just constructor injection in the properties.
If you had property injection and then said everything that's optional becomes a property instead of a constructor parameter, would that solve this problem?
It would help, yeah. Yep. But
Well, now you have other problems.
Well, there are other issues around.
I know that there are other issues around it, but if this is going to keep coming up over and over and over and over again, does it make sense to not try to solve this problem until that other more underlying problem is solved first?
I'll tell you. So one strategy that we have used is we have the implementations be internal and the abstractions be public, so that we could change around the constructors like as required. But then that has different issues.
Would it work with the current tech if your longest constructor has default options or default parameters?
It does work. So that's one thing that does work today.
Yeah, it seems like a combination of having an existing default constructor, which I assume the type has, plus making only this longest one and giving everything as a default parameter, and then just following default parameter evolution rules would solve this going forward. You'll end up with a bunch of constructors that are marked as editor browsable never, just for legacy reasons. But essentially, you end up with two default visible public constructors. One's the empty one, and one has everything as a optional parameter.
Yeah, but I don't think that will work, right? Because let's say in V1 you have A, B, and C as options you pass to the constructor. Now you want to add an optional D. Right, so now if you add in another constructor that now takes A, B, C, D, but you mark D as optional, well then now the call of A, B, C is ambiguous.
No, if only one of them has default parameters, you'll still have an exact binding to the ABC one. You can't remove it, and it has to forward correctly, or it has to do the behaviors correctly. But it's just the evolution of default parameters.
I see. You're saying because the compiler will prefer the one that takes ABC, will not consider the one that takes D. Right. I guess that makes sense.
IntelliSense can't. IntelliSense won't see it because it's EB never, but that's actually the one that the compiler will pick.
I mean, that's a good example here. When you look at the constructors you have here, it does not look like that's what you do today, right? Like otherwise, I don't understand why logger filter options in the middle is different.
Yes. Scroll around, actually. Show me this whole instructor list.
Because you have the logger factory
These
options
ones should be like
I options in the top is not wrapped in another thing in the middle, and is options monitor in the bottom.
Yeah.
Jesus.
So I don't know if that was some copy pasta or.
Yeah.
So providers, I options, factory options. So I think the original arguments were empty, but.
So, yeah, I mean, like we have exactly like 4 other constructors today, which is exactly like this one without the options parameter. So basically about like, if you look to the first one, which is taking options only, we already have one which doesn't take any options. It doesn't take any parameters, I mean.
So today you have one that has no arguments, you have one that only takes providers, you have one that takes providers and filter options.
That's right. Yeah.
But then I don't understand from here to here. You have logger filter options and you have I options monitor of logger filter options.
Right, because I think in the implementation, it's already creating one from the other, I believe.
Yeah, that's the thing that makes it hard, because now you have
But
effectively
we already have
disjoint
this
groups.
constructors.
No, I
We already
understand
have
that. That's why I'm but to Jeremy's point, right? If we, like, in order to keep DI brain dead simple, you want simple chaining, right? You basically want to have all previous ones to be basically prefixes of the current one. As soon as you have discrepancies like this, it now means when you add new things, you probably need to add them to two disjoint groups effectively, and that can result in ambiguities if you're not super careful.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you know, if the one that takes logger filter options is internally just deferring to something to do the options monitor version of it, then nothing says you have to allow somebody who went from that particular 2-parameter constructor to then still be able to call the one with all the defaults. Like, you can make them convert to using a monitor instead of a fixed value.
Okay, so suggestion here is just to remove one of those, right?
Well, I don't have a suggestion here
So
because
here's
it
the
seems like
question.
the damage has already been done, kind of.
So yeah, so this thing is already almost dead. So here's the question then. So if we want to avoid breaking changes, right? At least in 5, maybe in 6, we can remove more things. What is the minimum that we could add? Could we add 1 overload, like the very last one that we know is DA activated, pass in the factory options, and then the rest you get null, and you can't change the options unless you use the DA activated one that is the longest?
So my recommendation would be to delete the first 3 proposed new constructors and leave the last one with every parameter defaulted.
Yep. Yeah.
The only thing that it cuts out is passing filter options without the I options monitor wrapper. And that just means that the direction that the API is taking in the future is that should not have been a constructor that was public.
Yep.
Okay. Sounds good.
Let's do that. That seems reasonable, just because the whole thing is crazy.
I think separately we're going to have guidance on DI instantiated types anyway, because they don't tend to fit the patterns that we tend to use for BCL types. So I don't think the typical things that we tend to apply here.
It's kind of like a couple patterns. There's like, if you need to add new required things, this will come up every time. And there's a bunch of different strategies, like have an options object that can be mutated, passed into your constructor, add more constructors, make it internal so it doesn't matter. We kind of have we have a mix of all 3 of those in ASP.NET, and there's no really good, like, amazing solution. It's kind of like trade-offs, right? Or you could just stop adding new required things.
You don't use iService Provider for anything?
That only happens when you need to activate things lazily, deferred. That's kind of, so those are the things that emerge from using DI. Beautiful, I know.
It is beautiful.
I mean, one of the interesting things, though, is that it's, you tell people you're not ever really supposed to new these things up by hand. Always use a DI system to new it up for you.
Yeah.
Even when you're unit testing, like, get a helper method to new it up for you. Don't new it up within your test.
Yeah, and to be fair, logging at first was not tied to DI at all. It didn't have any of these connectors. It had like a super empty one that you could call AppProvider on. And then as we added more stuff to it, it got hard to create by hand, because now you have to pass in like 4 arguments instead of passing in 1.
And that's the problem with DI, is that it's fundamentally viral, right? Like, if you really want to get the benefits of DI, you kind of have to use it all the way down.
Just out of curiosity.
That's part of it.
Yep. Sir, go ahead.
I think you tend to design types taking in more things than you would think about, which makes it kind of hard to create. And that's kind of the main thing, right? Like, if things are passed into you, then you can't have defaults that kind of grab things from the ambient nature of the universe. Yes. You can't have statics pulling things out of, like, here and there, which means you can test it, but it also means you have to pass in all the context everywhere. So that's kind of like the double-edged sword.
Yeah. How many times has this API been broken in the past?
None yet.
Okay.
The factory itself, none.
Okay.
Yeah.
Apparently it's too new.
Yeah. No. So for extensions, the bar is really high, right? The bar is like the same as the BCL, pretty much, because this thing runs on Net Framework and Net Core, Net Standard. So we're very breaking the APIs here. But I still think we maybe want to deprecate things that we think are bad, and then remove it in the future version.
Imo, sounds like we need to fast track some of the better obsolete stuff that's been on the back burner.
Isn't that a whole thing though?
I mean, like, from an implementation standpoint, we have all the things we need, and now you just apply the attribute.
Yeah, but we've been putting off for quite some time actually applying them to APIs because we keep saying, oh, we'll get around to having a meeting for it. It sounds like we should actually have that meeting. Yeah,
we should get this list. Like, I mean, there was a list earlier, right? I just have to update this thing again to actually reflect what we actually meant there.
Right. Well, especially because it's getting to be so late in the preview cycle, like we need to start acting on some of those obsoletions. Like,
I agree.
Okay.
So, are there any things that should be defaulted in the constructor of Logger Factory, or should we just have the options be required? Should options be optional to null, or what's the...
No, options is the flags. I mean, so options has to be defaulted to none, which is...
No, I meant
well,
like...
but you're not taking the options, you're taking an I options of options.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. So this will be null.
So it can be default to null, and null means use the default, or use whatever internal version of defaults you feel like using, which don't have to be public.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
there's a helper called options.create, but it's not a huge deal. We could just make it.
I mean, if there's still scenarios for somebody calling new on this directly, then I think that the new constructor should be all defaulted parameters, and if there aren't, then it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So just saying they're all defaulted seems the most flexible because it doesn't have a major cost and it doesn't box anything out.
So we default all parameters on the last constructor?
Yeah, and then it's essentially, so it would behave whatever the same as the default constructor does, right? So if you don't provide an IEnumerable of logging provider, that does something, right?
Okay.
Unless providers is actually a required parameter, but I don't think so, given that you were
it's not required.
proposing an options only constructor. So the calling the longest constructor with essentially calling it empty would be the same as calling the default constructor. So just everything that was null is then acceptable.
Okay.
So if nullability is turned on for this one, then all of them also get marked as null accepting. So.
Yeah. So basically, should we now make providers and filter options both be equals null?
So okay, so one I think the thing about equals null, I think it works everywhere, but we need to make sure that it works on all the providers that we support. So that's the other thing. So we do support it. I think we do support it. I think it is a required feature of our container abstraction, but I am a little wary of making it null everywhere. Just maybe there's subtle behavior that doesn't work on other container providers. And just for context, like our DI container is an abstraction. Well, it's both an abstraction and implementation. And so if you plug in a different DI container implementation, it should still work with these constructors. So
well, but even if the DI system itself didn't understand that the API had a suggested default, like it's not going to, like if it just looked at it and said, I need a thing that produces an I options of logger factory options, but can't find one, that's failure, which would be the same as whether or not shipped it as default here.
Well, so it could pick a different constructor, which is worse, right? So failing is fine. Picking a different overload is worse. That's what you don't want.
Okay, so if it finds a signature, a constructor it can't call, it excludes it from the set instead of failing.
Yeah, it might. Yeah, that's the danger. Yeah. So let's just verify that works, and then we can make it all null if it does work. If not, then we should just add a new required parameter in a longer constructor.
So help me understand why you need to have one. Can't you export a default instance, or does that's not supported?
Export a default instance. What do you mean? You mean like meth?
Yeah. Do you have the notion of the user can specify an I options or logger factory options, and when they don't, you have a default one? Or does the default
No.
literally have to be omitted from the graph?
Default has to be, so there's no defaults. You have to have something in the container that actually can produce a blah. We happen to have, so for options, we happen to have one added by someone else by default. So those work. There's always an options of blah in the container.
Right.
If you use it in a Spinnet core or in hosting. If you were to create a container like from scratch and not call the things that add the options implementation, it would just blow up because it couldn't find one.
I mean, that seems like something you should probably think about. Is like, how do you add new things that are effectively required?
Yeah,
I mean,
so new required things are a problem, right? Yeah.
Because you can either do one of two things. You can either say there's this first class feature of like there's a default and the user can override the default, or you say, you know, the thing that actually constructs things and injects things is aware of default parameters, right? Like that's really the thing.
Yeah, I think it works. We should just confirm it before we like set it in stone.
Do you know the list of third-party like containers? Is it literally every DI container ever written, or is it like 3 or 4?
No, so we have a list on the actual. Okay. It might have gotten lost in the move, but in the README of the extensions repo, that maybe if you look at a branch, there's a list of containers that work.
Yeah, we should probably make sure we work with the top ones and make sure that they actually work. Yeah.
So how it works is we ship a set of specs that are tests, and then you run those tests on your implementation, and if they pass, stuff works.
You can put the sticker on your project.
Yeah, I passed 10 tests. Is that kind of test? And I believe we used to actually run the third-party test. I'm not sure if that got removed in the move. We used to actually run those containers as part of the test, but I'm pretty sure it's gone now.
I'm not sure if this test still exists or not, so I can follow up with Mariam to see if this is the case.
I'm like 86% sure they're gone, but here in the chat, I pasted the actual teams. Oh, look, there it is. Good job, Saurabh. But here's the actual link to the test we used to have. And there's more than that, but those are kind of the main ones that are there. And I believe they do work.
Are you talking about the specification test?
There's a set of tests called the external DI test, and it kind of has all the implementation.
They might be in extensions repo.
Yeah, they are. Well,
yeah.
In master, it's definitely in a branch.
I think it's in master.
Let me check.
Okay, we can take this offline, and we can investigate more about how to run these tests on that.
Cool. I mean, otherwise looks good to me. Probably doesn't look good for Jeremy, but he's just not enlightened yet.
Well, dude, just wait until we bring the other PRs for extensions. You're gonna love them. So there's APIs everywhere.
breaking changes everywhere. You get one. You get one. You get one. All right.
Okay. So is this considered approved or?
Yeah, I already marked it approved. I added the thing.
Thank you.
So go party.
Excellent.
go break the world.
I'll try to do that.
It comes natural, I'm sure. All right, so no idea who this is. Oh, Tarek, you're also on this one.
Yeah, this should be simple also, hopefully. So basically, this one is approved before. So to summarize, the issue here is we have GetEncodings APIs that can enumerate all encodings we support. And in the .NET Core, we started to have the model of the encoding provider, which is like you can plug in your encoding if you want. And we have moved almost most of our encoding support to the provider. It's called CodePage Encoding Provider. And we proposed about to expose a new API from the provider, which can enumerate the encodings that it supports. And this will get reflected to the main method in the encoding, which is GetEncodings. So this API got approved with some tweak, but the catch here is GetEncodings is returning array of encoding info type. And we discovered after this item get approved, we discovered that encoding info class doesn't have public constructor. So the whole idea here, the addition that I'm proposing here is just to add a new constructor to the GetEncoding and make it public on the encoding info. If you go down, I can show you.
I was just reading my notes from like 2 years ago, and I have literally zero memories of writing those notes. So it's
yeah. So
I guess it's your comment somewhere, right?
Yeah, this is your comments, I believe.
Yeah, this is the one I just read, like the.
Right. Okay.
And then I think you probably have some comments on the.
It's literally just taking the existing internal constructor that's there that takes code page name and display name and making that public.
Yes.
What does it mean if you don't know what a code page means? Like, is 0 the I'm not a code page based encoding?
No, we don't have all encodings we support. It has to have a code page.
Okay.
Yeah, but code page 0 means the default in general. But this is a different issue.
But really, I mean, the question is really if there should be an overload that doesn't take a code page or any other forms of overloading that need to be on here. But if all .NET encodings have an
the encoding class itself, it has a properties called code page, so we have to support it anyway.
That's fair.
Yeah.
And Tarek, the getEncoding method on encoding info just turns around and calls encoding.getEncoding with that code page. So that suggests that there's a one-to-one mapping between code page and encoding info. You could never have two different encodings with the same code page.
That's right. But the catch here is we have the provider model. So if somebody created his own provider and tried to provide exactly the same encoding, so we are trying to get the first one and return to the user. I mean, so at the end result will not have any duplicates, but it could be there is a duplicate between the providers.
Right, but even if there's, what I'm pointing out is if there's a duplicate between providers, the way encoding info is currently implemented, when you call .getEncoding on it, it's not necessarily going to return that provider's encoding.
So we go to the provider first and try to get the encoding from the provider. And if
Right, but there could be multiple providers with the same code page, right?
That's right, yes.
And they're all going to return the encoding from the first one.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which suggests that maybe you want encoding info that takes code page name, display name, and which provider is producing it. So that getEncoding will ask that provider first or only.
So my point here is we are going to filter that before returning the result to the user. So we will not, we don't.
Who will?
I mean the API, encoding.getEncodings.
Right, but if I have an encoding provider that says that I'm using the the Linuxy one that we're adding support for on Windows.
Right.
That if I have that encoding provider object and I call GetEncodings, and it says it has an encoding for, I don't know, 451, I think is ENUS.
Yeah,
Sure, whatever.
1253.
So it says that there's an encoding for this code page, and then on that encoding info, I call .getEncoding. It's not necessarily giving me the one off the provider that I asked for, because if the system one is registered first, I'll get the system encoding and not the provider specific encoding.
Yeah, I mean, so this is a behavior we need to define here. I mean, like, should we return the system one or should we return the provider one? So my take here is to return the provider one, because
right, but you can't accomplish that with the constructor you're exposing, because it doesn't know which provider it came from.
Yeah, you're suggesting just adding the encoding provider as a parameter to the constructor, right?
That's my suggestion, yeah.
But how this will help? I mean, like, so the encoding.getEncodings API itself is the one which is calling the provider. So it knows what provider it's calling, right?
But
And
encoding info is what's handed back from GetEncodings, right?
From the provider, yes.
So
Not a
the
great
only
name.
consumer of the only consumer of encoding info is encoding.getEncodings?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm a little confused because I'm looking at the callers of encoding info.getEncoding, and it looks like there are no callers internally of that API.
This is a public API.
Yes, but because there are no internal callers, it sounds like we can actually change the behavior of it to match what our customers expect rather than what the runtime itself expects.
Right. I mean, we are free to define whatever behavior we want here. But
well, I guess my question to me is if this method is never used, no one can currently construct one of these things, and we don't ever hand these out of the runtime. The behavior of GetEncoding kind of doesn't matter, right?
Well, we do hand these out. An encoding info array is exposed via encoding.getEncodings.
Right.
Oh, it is?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Right.
I thought.
But can I remember the name now, it's ICU. So can I directly instantiate an ICU encoding provider?
Yeah, you can create your own provider and provide, implement the APIs that it return whatever.
Right. So my concern would be if I said, new ICU encoding provider, .getEncodings.first.getEncoding, that I'm not actually necessarily getting the one from ICU.
Right.
And that seems like a semantic behavioral problem to me. Because I said I wanted ICU providers encoding. So why did you give me?
If you want to guarantee to get the one from the provider, so you can call the provider directly. You don't have to call the public API from the encoder.
Right. I'm just suggesting that encoding info should track which provider it came from, so that if you call the GetEncodings on a provider, that when you call GetEncoding on that encoding info, assuming that's a member, that it gives you the one from the provider that created the encoding info as opposed to the one from the system.
I still understand how you
just to return that. But my whole point is nobody asking for that today. So if we need to just to add it, because I'm not seeing it's adding any value for what we need to support here.
Well, the problem is you're making GetEncodings public on the provider. If GetEncodings is protected and is only called by plumbing, then I don't care anymore. But if it's public, then someone can instantiate a provider, call GetEncodings, then try to, from that encoding info, instantiate that encoding, and then they might not get the one from that provider. And that is a problem.
So encoding info itself, it has properties called encoding, which can return the encoding from the encoding info itself without going to...
But that's what we're talking about, Derek. It's got encoding info has a method called getEncoding.
Yes.
Which just turns around and calls encoding.getEncoding with the code page.
Right, yeah.
So it's not going back to the provider. It's not necessarily going back to the provider that this encoding info came from.
You're losing information along the way.
Yeah, if we can change the behavior to ensure that it will return the encoding from the provider if we need to.
How do we do that?
We have all information inside the provider itself. We can know which encoding they are requiring, and we can get it from there.
If I have 3 different providers,
right,
all of which construct an encoding info with the same code page name and display name, there is no information internally that would allow you to distinguish between those 3 providers and which ones to go back to.
Okay, you are talking about which level? I mean, from the public API in the encoding itself, or from the provider level?
Both.
Well, if you called EncodingProvider.GetEncodings and it gave you back an encoding info array, like presumably you know which instance of the encoding provider you called it on, so I don't think that's a huge concern. But if you're calling the static encoding.getEncodings method and it's aggregating everything, then yes, now it's a problem.
Well, assuming
I still don't understand how it even works with the singleton encoding provider. Like if you're calling it from the encoding provider, because you're still getting back an encoding info that's not tied to that provider, and you're going to go back to the global method.
At that point, you wouldn't call GetEncoding because it might return the wrong thing. At that point, what you would do is you would get the encoding name and then go back to the encoding provider directly and say, hey, please give me the encoding with this name or code page.
That's exactly the issue, is exposing an API that you shouldn't call because it's going to do the wrong thing.
Oh, yeah. I'm saying right now there's a way around it, but it's very unclean.
Yeah.
Yeah, like if the GetEncodings on the provider is only supposed to be used by plumbing, then it needs to not be public. It should be protected, and then there's some stuff inside where encoding, with all its static methods, can call into it using an internal method that wraps the protected method.
I mean, my question is, generally speaking, like, do we support that different encodings from different providers have the same code page?
Yeah.
It seems like the API makes the assumption that it's unique, right? Otherwise, what does encoding.getEncoding with a code page mean?
No, there is some scenarios that, of course, I mean, I didn't see it in real life, but some scenarios like if somebody needs to override the current encoding, I mean, they don't like, I mean, like we have a bug that we never fix, and they need to fix it themselves. So they can provide their own provider with this encoding, which is override.
Yeah, then I agree with what Steven said. Like, if that's a supported scenario, then, but then I'm not sure that the fix that Jeremy proposed is the right one per se, because if I can still call encoding.getEncoding 42, what does it mean if I now replaced encoding 42? Like, that seems not well defined.
That's going to be a problem no matter what.
Right. But that's what I'm saying. Like, if we say it's a problem regardless, then why is this encoding thing and the encoding provider a new problem? Because if I can't safely say that an encoding maps to a particular code page, then this encoding provider thing is just yet another version of that, because now it completely depends on how you got your encoding, right? If you walked the encoding provider and got the encoding info and then constructed the encoding from there, will yield you a different result from going straight to encoding.getEncoding, right? So like you already are in a world where you lose information depending on which entry point you chose.
Right, but I'm looking at it as, so my sort of semi-scenario here is you have a specific provider, you call the GetEncodings, and you have a sorting function that's going to say, of all the ones that this provider supported, this is the one that is the best match. And then you call .getEncoding off the one that was the best sort. If you got it from a particular provider, so you expect that this is being a factory method from the provider, but instead it goes back to the system default order list and doesn't necessarily come from the provider. You need to yourself have tracked the provider to call .getEncoding with that code page.
Okay, so
the weird pattern.
Yeah, the other idea I have is, but this will need to do more allocations, which is instead of providing the constructor that takes the code page and the name and the display name, we can have a constructor that can take the encoding itself. So while we enumerating from the provider, we create the encoding class itself and return it. So we create encoding info, and from the constructor, which is takes the encoding class.
I think that might be a bit overkill, honestly. You can imagine caching the encoding info instances, but not necessarily caching the encoding instances themselves.
Aren't the encoding instances always stateless? Or supposed to be?
Sometimes they're mutable.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, yeah. I'm just trying to think about like if there will be any problem to create the encoding itself from inside the provider without need the public API again or something.
But at that point, why return an encoding info? Why not just return the encoding directly? Like you can the encoding.
The idea is we were trying to not allocate a lot of objects. I mean, because encoding, I mean, you have to allocate all encodings at that time, which is
right. But if encoding info took code page name, display name, and a nullable provider, where null means just use the system meta provider, then that allows the .getEncoding method to know which provider it came from and to just do the callback. It's one pointer bigger in the structure, but who cares?
I think this is reasonable ask. Yes, I agree with that.
Because even if the system, the top level static encoding.getEncodings does deduplication and it has its own order, and well, somebody already called code page 0, so no one else is allowed to return an encoding info for it. If you went to the provider directly, you'll still get a sensible result, and that's my concern here.
So can you succinctly describe what the ill-defined behavior is that you would observe? Like, who do you basically call?
With the current API?
Yeah.
So you have a specific provider. So you have the ICU encoding provider. You call GetEncodings. You run that through a sorting function that returns the best encoding info that you have. So you get that back, and now you say, great, this was the best encoding info for my scenario, encoding info.getEncoding. If that does not return an ICU encoding, or something from the ICU encoding provider, that feels like a very bad API to me.
So, okay, I buy that, but like what I don't understand is, so you call ICU encoding provider .getEncodings, which give you back an encoding info, right?
Yeah.
So why would that not give you only encoding infos that came from ICU?
The problem is that on that instance, encoding info has a method getEncoding, which just calls the static encoding.getEncoding code page. So it's going to go back to the global lookup, not back to that provider.
And if a higher binding provider also provides the same code page, then you get back that provider's version of that code page instead of ICU's.
Okay, so how do I construct an encoding then? Normally, like so I'm not supposed to call for encoding info GetEncoding?
I assume there's encoding provider.getEncoding of int, and that's effectively what encoding info needs to call.
There is, yeah.
I see now. I see. So the problem is really encoding info GetEncoding then.
Right. So the solution that I suggest is add a fourth parameter to the public constructor, which is a nullable encoding provider. Null means use the system default meta provider, and otherwise it's only use this one provider that it was bound to.
Yeah, I was about to say, like, it seems like the easiest thing would be that encoding info would take an encoding provider as one of the arguments in the constructor.
Yeah.
Right.
And then maybe it should expose that back as a property, but that seems less necessary.
I mean, it seems to me the most logical thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the whole idea is to guarantee about like any encoding info object will always create the encoding from the provider that it created this encoding info object. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. This also means that we would need to just fabricate a dummy provider for built-in things like ASCII, UTF-8, so on. That can be an internal implementation detail.
Well, again, like null could mean just call the static method.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's a nullable parameter then, not a.
That's what I said.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Sorry, I misheard that then.
Yeah.
Okay. Null is the meta provider.
Sounds great. Okay.
Cool.
So that means encoding info, the first argument would be encoding provider, that would be nullable.
Or the last one, I don't care.
Yeah, last one would be better.
Yeah.
I mean, considering that we only make it public, so for people that implement encoding providers to call, it seems the most sensible to me. But
I mean, the question really is it nullable
in the
at default, or is it just nullable? And if it's nullable in default, then it has to go last.
Fair enough.
But I don't have a strong opinion.
I mean, it seems like if I were to derive from encoding provider, you want me to pass it in, right?
Yes.
That's fair.
And given that the only customers of this constructor right now will be the ones doing that, it seems almost a required parameter would be better.
That's fair. And then the system one can cheat and call the existing internal constructor and has a null provider and knows how to deal with that. It doesn't have to be, the meta provider doesn't have to be part of the contract.
Yeah, that seems almost the most logical thing then. So would we then even expose the I guess we would still expose the property, right?
If you expose the property, now you need to have a dummy internal provider. Like you can't make that nullable.
Why not?
So it would be weird that it was a required constructor parameter from the only constructor you can see, but it says that it can sometimes be null when you ask for it.
Yeah.
I mean, reality is a bitch, right?
But, sure.
It is, but we shouldn't shape reality to be unexpected.
Yeah, I guess I buy that. So that, I mean, it seems like the value is also low, so I'm okay with just omitting the property entirely.
Certainly, we could also just make an internal type of system encoding provider, which is not public, and it returns the singleton instance of that, which just wraps all the static methods. So.
Yeah, but that one seems more like what Tarek said earlier, like nobody's asking for that, so like maybe we should just not have the property for now and then deal with that once somebody's asking for that.
Also, the provider class is defined in other package. I mean, so I'm not sure if we can depend from the core on the other class that defined in different place.
Well, the provider type itself, the abstract type, is defined in core, but you're right, the implementations are all out of band.
Yeah.
The base class has to be in core, otherwise core wouldn't be able to call into the out of band implementations.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yes. Okay. Yeah, I was wrong. Yeah.
I mean, if it is true that encoding provider is at a higher layer, then the solution would be bunk of int to encoding factory. Like
an encoding provider exists. We don't need to work around that.
Yeah, but anyway, I agree with Emma. I mean, like, I don't think we need to expose the property from now, at least. And we can have just the constructor take the extra parameter, nullable one.
Yeah, to the property later.
Yes.
All right. So non-nullable provider in the public constructor. Implementation detail, we deal with it however we feel like it. And no property to expose the input parameter. Seems fine.
Yeah. And we need to add the GetEncodings method to encoding provider.
Yeah. Which is part of the proposal.
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically you are supposed to, so basically we would call encoding provider the one that takes a string or the one that takes an int?
You mean as an implementation detail?
I guess you have to override both of them to have consistent names anyway, right? Yeah. But we should probably like spec what we use to look up things, right?
I mean, right now it uses code page, so may as well just use the same on the provider.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so
yeah, unless at the same time we wanted to add encoding provider.get encoding of encoding info, but then that seems too complicated.
Yeah.
Because that would let you do something like use, because I don't remember if code pages are different between ENUS and ENCA. If they are, then the code page solves it. Otherwise, it would give you the sublocale of English United States. Where's a place that I'm allowed to make fun of? Southern Indiana. Of having a different set of sorting that excludes y'alls or something.
I believe y'alls is a plural possessive.
Well, I was using it as the plural of the singular y'all.
Okay.
Which is a mass noun. But
so default implementation of GetEncodings is returns a non-null empty array, I guess.
We already said this last time. We said where is it? I'll pass my comment. Yeah, we said GetEncoding should be version return an empty list instead of throwing. While this isn't correct, it means that one provider that isn't updated doesn't spoil the enumeration for everyone else.
Right. We shouldn't throw from inside the provider, right? Yeah, the other comment from the previous design review is GetEncodings in the provider should return enumerable instead of array. I'm not sure.
I mean,
I don't care enough about that.
Yeah, but this I just mentioned because this was one of the comments from previous review.
I mean, honestly, it seems nicer, especially it lets a provider use yield return and any other iterator pattern where they don't have to pre-count it. And if if the target scenario of this is you're going to just for each or if you're doing essentially select mini provider dot get encodings dot unique of code page, yeah, I can do link. That IEnumerable seems better because then you get to you're not allocating the fixed size arrays and then throwing them away.
Okay.
So
sounds good to me.
So I would recommend IEnumerable of encoding info, and then the default implementation just returns enumerable.empty of encoding info.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Ship it.
Cool.
We call this GetEncoding infos, or do we not? We're not actually returning.
No, we already using it in the encoding class GetEncodings, which is return encoding info. So
yeah, I think this is
I see.
Be consistent in the space instead of have the correct name.
Right.
And should it be public or should we make it protected?
May as well make it public. There's no good reason to make it protected, right?
Yeah.
Works for me. Alright, so I copied and pasted the thing down, clarified enumerable without empty behavior.
What you currently have on the screen, maybe you just didn't hit refresh. Still has returning an array instead of an enumerable.
Yeah, I said it in the comments. I didn't actually. All right, I think that's good enough.
Yep.
Eva, you're up.
Hi. So we actually talked about this back in January, and it was partially approved at that point. Basically, string split options, string.split. Turns out there are a lot of places in the code where we split, we get all of the elements of the resulting array, and then we call trim on every single one of them because we don't want white space. A very typical use case for this is parsing like comma-separated values, stuff like that. So yeah, the proposal is we add an entry to string split options. Right now, the two entries are none and remove empty entries. I had proposed also adding trim entries. and the behavior is pretty much what it says. It trims members of the array before it returns the array back to you. If you specify both trim and remove empty entries, it trims the entries and then sees if anything is empty, and then at that point it chucks them from the array.
Is it already a flex enum?
I believe it is, yes.
Yes.
But we only have 2 options right now.
Yep. and that's why we do this, right? So we could add stuff in the future.
I guess that makes sense, yeah.
I mean, yeah, it's plural, so it should have been flags. It's good to see that we were consistent back in the framework 1.0 days.
Yeah. When we last reviewed this in January, it got punted back to me saying we should see if we need trim or trim start, trim end broken out. When I looked through all of the call sites, I didn't see anyone that would actually benefit from trim start and trim end being split out like that. The only people who were doing this were people who just called trim, basically. So I figured may as well not complicate things.
To devil's advocate the scenario, in a CSV, particularly if you do Excel export to CSV, if the value itself contains another comma, then it gets quoted. I assume that there's no intention of making string.split support complicated CSVs with essentially with quoting and escaping and
correct.
Okay,
correct.
You brought up CSVs as your trim target, and I'm making sure that we know that it doesn't solve all CSVs, only trivial ones.
And in fact, while I was actually implementing this, I found 2 examples of that and opened up bugs.
I mean, can we at least say on record that you should not use string.split for CSV files? I mean,
yeah.
Because as soon as you do CSV files, you need to kind of handle quotes, and you need to kind of handle separators in quotes, and so string split will stop working for you quickly.
Yeah, it turns out there are actually quite a few cases where people are doing kind of like fake CSV instead of real CSV, where they know for a fact that everything is supposed to be a number.
Yeah,
or they don't need things quoted, stuff like that.
Yeah.
But even numbers, like good old Germany, right, where we use commas as decimal separators.
Yeah. Yep.
I can tell you the number of cases where I worked for companies or with companies that used those so-called cheating CSV parsers, and always regretted that.
Yeah, I mean, nothing is stopping us from in the future adding another flag that says
.csv.
Well, essentially, support quotes or something, which understands quotes and or removes that. I mean, we could make this API be smarter in the future. We're not limited by the lack of that flag right now.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, like trim start, trim end seems more likely, honestly, like that, and that seems already fairly remote.
If you look at the maybe fixed by link at the top of the issue that GitHub lovingly put there, you can see all the different places in the code that I already fixed up to use this API, and none of them were doing CSV specific things. They were just doing CSV like things.
Maybe fixed by. Why maybe? Like, they're basically telling you, oh, it's Levi, we don't know whether he actually fixes that, or like, why?
Yeah, something like that.
I mean, if the person says resolves, then I mean, come on, that's a bit passive aggressive.
Or maybe made worse by.
Yeah. Yes. Anyway, so that seems reasonable then.
Yeah.
There is one other thing that I wanted to call out here, which is there is some weird edge case behavior of string.split where you can pass in the maximum number of items that you want to receive in the backing array. So you can say things like string.split on comma, return max 10 items. And even if it sees 20 commas in there, for instance, you will get back a 10 element array, which makes sense, except for the behavior of string.split today is as soon as it sees that 9th comma and it says, oh, I'm only supposed to return 10 elements, it literally returns the entire remainder of the string without doing any type of further post-processing. I preserved that behavior here, even though I believe it to be incorrect.
No, I mean, that makes sense. I think I've used that for my own lame CSV of I know that the first in values can't have any nested commas in them because they're enum names or integers or whatever, and then it's like, oh yeah, and the rest of the string I have to process separately.
Yeah, but what that means though is like if you say remove empty, ignore trim entries, say that you pass in remove empty entries, and the very last thing in the string is a comma, then that means that the last element in the array that you get back will literally be an empty string, which is presumably not what you wanted because you passed in remove empty entries. But that is an existing behavior that I did not change.
And presumably that means you're also not trimming it.
Correct.
Yep. Yeah, that seems consistent.
UTF-8 string is different, by the way, because this is already implemented on UTF-8 string, and the UTF-8 string behavior actually looks at everything. So if you see 9 commas and you said remove or give me back 10 things, I'm sorry, if you see 20 commas and you say give me back 10 things, it will check to see, oh, is everything else empty? Let me not actually yield them as part of the return value.
I would recommend you match the existing behavior for consistency.
Yeah. Yeah.
Since string.split has been around for 20 years and UTF-8 string.split isn't public yet.
Yep. We also have a read-only span of char version of string.split, which is in PR review right now. I haven't checked to see what the behavior on that method is.
All right, so that one is done. Now this one, you're still up.
Yeah, we should obsolete this.
I mean, I have no concerns. I mean, just for context, this guy is basically used by the compiler when you use fixed statements over strings.
Yeah.
And you said because we added get pinnable reference, the compiler will prefer that one now over the offset to string data.
The C# compiler will, yeah. There's the F# compiler is already updating their stuff. C++ CLI apparently still calls this, but I just need someone to point me to where to open up that bug.
But even if they didn't fix that for 5.0, marking this obsolete wouldn't break anything, right? Because presumably the compilers aren't saying, I wanted to use that API, but it was obsolete, so I'm not going to.
Yeah, the compilers aren't going to be broken by marking this obsolete. Really, what this is if you yourself are calling this API for some reason, we want you to stop.
Right. I just meant C++ CLI and F#. If they did nothing, they shouldn't be broken by putting obsolete on this.
Yeah, the people who might be calling this API are people who are emitting dynamic methods, for instance. And we want to tell those people, like, don't call this. Instead, call get pinnable reference.
But I mean, to Steven's point, right? The whole point of obsoleting this is so we can change the behavior, so that that behavior change will break anybody who called the API, whether it's a compiler or a human being, right?
Correct. So we're obviously going to have to allow the existing ecosystem of binaries to continue to work, people who might still be calling this API. So it would require that existing DLLs, which are already compiled with this, like when we're ingesting them into the JIT importer, like we would still need to somehow handle them correctly. But if we can start reducing the number of DLLs that we have to special case, because we can start getting people off of this API, that makes it less likely that we will, misrecognize a pattern when we eventually do make this change.
What is the change that we would make?
One of the things that we were trying to do was experiment with doing narrow strings in the framework, strings that are backed with ASCII instead of UTF-16.
And that would affect the offset to the data? Because we don't flag up front?
It would mean that the data for the string is actually not in line with the string object. It's actually in a backing array as a completely separate object. There is no offset. Yeah, like literally, if you call this property, like the property is going to have to throw platform not supported exception, because if you try to use it, you're going to get an access violation. Which means that when we're code genning IL that calls it, we actually have to pretend that you had written a completely different code pattern. But we experimented with doing that a while back, and it turns out that logic is very error prone, and we have gotten it wrong. So if we can get as few people as possible continuing to use that pattern, because we're updating the compilers and everyone else to call the new API, that increases our odds of success, because it means that we're messing with your IL less during the import phase.
I didn't even know that we would have fixed up IL on loading.
We would have to, yeah. Because you want your net standard 2.0 DLL to continue to work on .NET 5, .NET 6, .NET 7, right?
Well,
and maybe
I don't disagree with that. I'm just saying it's cool that we do that. Like, I wasn't aware that we even had this ability. Now I'm thinking of more creative ways to use this, which you probably don't want, but
I mean, we already have a couple scenarios that whether you've done, ready to run or engine or anything else, that the runtime can understand this was not built in the mode that it should have been, and it throws everything back at the JIT. So, and then the JIT does magic.
Yeah.
The JIT is magical, yes.
Yep. So that's what this is basically. Don't use this old API because it's possibly going to return the wrong thing if we ever make this change. Use a new API instead, which is always guaranteed to work.
So if somebody used the old compiler version against the new runtime, this will not generate any warning or anything during the compile time, right?
Correct. The compiler actually already special cases the new API and calls it if you're targeting a compliant runtime.
Well, but if they used the last pre-Roslyn version of the compiler.
Yeah.
But that was, again, Steve's comment of it would be very surprising that the compiler, which is the one producing the call to this, would bother looking up this thing that I'm about to blind call. Hey, wait a minute, that was marked obsolete.
Yeah, the compiler is not going to care.
Yeah, it's good to test the scenario actually.
But you would get the you built something, or you like do a reverse compile, and then so you build, like, it just builds dumb C# to call what the IL said instead of trying to do pattern matching to get back to what it might have looked like. And then now if you recompiled that, it would then say, hey, wait a minute, you're calling this get offset member, and that's deprecated.
Yeah. Conveniently, you can't represent in C# what the compiler would have generated in IL.
There we go.
Is that a cat complaining, Levi?
Yeah, there's a spider above me, and the cat's warning me that there's a spider.
Oh, that is very cute. I want.
I thought it wanted more expressive C# semantics.
That's what I thought too, but
you should listen to it, Levi.
I should. It's actually a few feet over to the side right now, so I'm not freaking out quite yet.
Well, if you let the cat loose, you know what happens, right? Like every time my cat ate a spider, it will basically eat the whole spider and then spit out the individual legs, which is very creepy.
Yes.
All right, so let's do this then. One seems like an obvious one that we can just approve as is. So my only question is, should we put a diagnostic ID on this guy?
So that I actually don't know, and I'll defer to this group. We obsoleted string.copy in a previous release without doing any type of diagnostic ID because we didn't have diagnostic IDs at that point.
Right.
And I see this as kind of in the same vein, like, don't misuse strings. And in this particular case, you should literally never ignore this warning. Like, you should always address it in your code, always.
To me, the only benefit here would be, I mean, generally speaking, I think obsoleting members is generally much less of a problem than obsoleting types, right? Because types will usually result in potentially hundreds of violations. But like the members seems less problematic. I mean, the only benefit here would be, as you said, like if there's other things that are like it, like for example, string.copy, having the same diagnostic ID might make it easier to point people to why that's a bad idea. Yeah, I don't think of this as you should suppress it. It's more like, okay, here's a diagnostic ID you should just freaking fix.
Yeah, and that's fine. I'll defer to the wisdom of this group here. But I know that when we had talked about better obsolescence in the past, we were we kind of bucketed things into a few different categories. One of the categories was like, I know what I'm doing. I kind of accept the fact that this is obsolete. And the other category is like, here's something you really do need to address in your code. This falls under the second bucket.
Yeah, I mean the benefit of a diagnostic ID would be that there's a docs page explaining the problem.
Yeah.
I mean, in fact, like, yeah, the only people who would see this are people who are literally emitting code by hand, which is a very small set, right? Everybody else who just does fixed would just, by recompiling, the compiler would just get pinnable reference now, right?
Correct. And in fact, we have unit tests, which use dynamic method to call this API. But I mean, of course, we're the runtime. Of course, we would write such unit tests. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, we can't really tell who calls this API because we can't differentiate between compilers emitting a call to this versus humans. But I mean, if I had to guess, the only people who probably do this are on the YouTube right now because it's people like Kevin, and then that's pretty much it, right? So probably,
yeah,
doesn't seem worthwhile overthinking this. I mean, I would also generally say if we later on decide we want to have a diagnostic ID, it is technically a breaking change to add one, but I would not necessarily object to that because to me that's in the same vicinity of analyzers, right? It's you just improve the diagnostic story, which seems fine.
I mean, adding a diagnostic ID here is fine.
We can change that one.
Well, it's a source breaking change because you change basically what diagnostics you produced, right? So like if you recompile, you may have suppressed the generic obsolete one, and if you change the diagnostic ID, well, now you get a diagnostic ID, right? But
if you were suppressing the generic one, it doesn't suppress individual ones?
No. That was a feed that we discussed this with the compiler team when we added the ability to add one. We concluded, like, if we would have to do extra work to do that, and we said, like, the cons outweigh the pros, or the pros outweigh the cons, I guess. It's like, it seems makes more sense to not do that. And I think in general, I'm okay with that as a source breaking change, because kind of the only cases where I can think of where we would like to do that is probably partially because we want to get it into its own bucket. And to me, it doesn't seem bad because the way I see it is the same as analyzers. Right? We would be very, very okay with adding an analyzer, and that would also have its own diagnostic ID, so it seems fine.
Maybe this is a separate conversation. It just caught me a little off guard because something like analyzers, I do have a big hammer, which is I can turn off the whole analyzer. How do I turn off all obsolete warnings?
You don't in that world, but like, how do you turn off all analyzers?
In my analyzer config, I just go and delete it.
So what do you delete? Because I mean, you would have to add one more diagnostic ID to the things you suppress, right?
Now remove the class.
I remove the analyzer
or the assembly.
Yeah.
Just snip it out of the list of stuff to do.
Yeah, you don't suppress it. You just remove the reference to it entirely.
Yeah, but like, I mean, that's the general thing, right? I mean, like as soon as you have to modify your project, like, I don't think this is. I mean, to me, it's just the way what you do is the same thing. Effectively, you basically reconfigure your project. Removing a particular analyzer to me is the same.
It's how much work I need to do. Maybe it's not a big deal because we're not going to have a lot of these. But if we end up in a world where I have 300 different diagnostic IDs for different obsoleted things, doesn't it feel like you would want to be able to turn them all off?
Can't you just no warn?
Not, but that's the thing. What would you no warn?
Yeah.
If
you don't have a diagnostic ID.
Individual diagnostic ID.
The compiler gives a general warning for all obsoletions.
But that's what we were just talking about. That Emo's saying that doing that doesn't actually suppress the ones that have their own diagnostic ID.
Right. That because that was the feature, right? So the compiler raises the warning under that ID, right? And so unless you have a suppression for that, it won't do that. I mean, that was called out in the spec as the behavior. Nobody, like the compiler team, agreed with that on our side. Nobody had concerns with this, so that's what we ended up doing. I mean, we haven't shipped it yet, like, so I think if you feel strongly, we can reopen that. I mean, it has pros and cons, right? Like the con is that a lot of people already have suppressions for obsolete ones, so none of them would benefit from the new ones. And that's probably the biggest con, right?
This kind of dovetails with what I had hinted at earlier, where because it's getting to be kind of late in the release cycle, we probably need to start getting some of these obsoletions in sooner rather than later so that we can get feedback on them. Not just this, but other obsoletions.
Yeah, I mean that's all right. So do this. Let me remove the blocking one as well. And let me hit comment. All right.
So did we decide diagnostic ID or not for this?
So what I'm hearing is that we don't feel strongly for adding one. To me, it's also adding one right now would be not super useful, because if we were to add one, I would probably change the one on copy as well. With the caveat I just called out, right? It is technically a breaking change because you changed the diagnostic ID, but to me that seems okay. Sure. Especially because the old that we just shipped this like 6 months ago, right, or 12 months ago or something like that. So it's a very recent obsolete. But given that the amount of people who call this API, I can probably get into one room. It's doesn't seem worth it. All right. Then this was this one. I think we can probably do one more. And surprise, surprise. This one is
4
also,
minutes.
One is also Levi's.
There was actually a customer request for this. Basically, the Latin 1 encoding is pretty common in web scenarios because it's the encoding that you use for things like HTTP headers. They're not actually ASCII, they're not actually UTF-8, they're actually ISO 88591, which is colloquially known as Latin 1. Right now, you can use encoding.getEncoding of the literal string ISO 88591, but like no one knows to do that. It's just kind of difficult to remember that that's what you have to do. So this is exposing it as a first-class property alongside UTF-8, alongside Unicode, and so on. The only public API being added here is the Latin 1 property getter. We're not making the Latin 1 encoding class itself public.
Seems fine.
There was a discussion about the name. I don't know enough to have a strong preference.
No, you're right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's. I mean, for me, I'm not sure about how many people outside Microsoft knows what Latin 1 means in general. Actually, people knows what the ISO 8859 means, but not the other way around. Yeah, but I'm not objecting. I mean, to have this property. I mean, it's useful anyway.
If you Google Latin 1, then the wiki page on ISO 8859 is the first thing to come up.
Yes. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I don't mind calling it ISO 8859.1, but we need to somehow have punctuation between the 8859 and the 1. And I don't really know how to do that other than use an underscore.
And that's what we did in the TLS cipher suites because of the same. There's a number here and that it needs to be broken.
Yeah.
I mean, I've always known this as Latin-1, or I guess Latin-1. I can't say if I knew of it before working at Microsoft, since it's, a decade and a half ago. But to me, Latin 1 seems obvious. And yeah, doing a search for Latin 1 with no hyphen or Latin-1, either way, the ISO 8859-1 Wikipedia page is the top hit.
So it's worth noting that at the top of that wiki page, it gives a link to the Latin 1 supplement Unicode block, which is the official name of the Unicode block for the upper half of ISO 8859-1.
So what, after creating this Latin 1 encoding, if we call .name on it, what it returns?
That's a good question. It's going to be whatever encoding, GetEncoding, ISO 8859.1.getName returns, because it's literally the equivalent of calling that API.
Yeah, okay. So the property will return a different name, I mean, or the ISO name, I mean. Okay.
Yeah, I don't remember offhand what it is.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like a reasonable compromise to say probably like encoding dot property name should probably match encoding get encoding dot name.
Well, I would say about like if somebody knows about like ISO 8859-1, so they will call get encoding with this name. They will not call the property, I believe. But I mean, like we are providing this property Latin1 property just for people who familiar with Latin1.
Yeah, it's an accelerator. That's all it is.
Yeah, I mean
So encoding get encoding Latin1 is valid, and it returns ISO 8859-1.
Yep, because we special case that name.
Right.
So if we were to use, I mean, like looking at search engine results, it looks like ISO 8859-1 is more like has more hits than Latin1. So I'm fine with using either one. I just don't know how we would name the ISO one, because you would have to put, like, we can't just omit the dash, right? And an underscore would look extremely ugly.
and writing it as ISO 8859 DASH1 would be very strange.
I would suggest to keep Latin1 and make the IntelliSense telling about like this is actually the ISO 8859. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I think Latin1 seems more sensible name.
Mm-hmm.
I also have an error in my description here. The narrowing conversion does best fit mapping. Right now, it says that it throws out everything that's above the ASCII range.
Sure. So I mean, it turns smart quotes into apostrophe or double quote as.
Oh no, sorry, I did call that out correctly here. Sorry, I can't even read what I wrote. Derp. No, the description here is correct. Ignore what I said.
It's always fine to find out that you're smarter than you think you would be. That to me is almost irrelevant, because I think whatever the behavior of encoding.getEncoding with that name, it should match whatever encoding.Latin1 gives you. It would seem very weird that they would differ. So whatever the behavior is the behavior that we have.
So you want it to return a special Latin1 encoding object that wraps the real Latin1 encoding and just says its name is Latin1?
No, I'm saying Diva was just talking about what the behavior is for certain ASCII ranges, and I'm saying I don't even care, because whatever the behavior is we currently have when you say encoding.getEncoding, encoding.Latin1 should match that behavior, right?
Okay.
So yeah, and it does. It does.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. We shouldn't change any behavior here.
Yeah. Right. Which is why, to me, it's a red herring whether we expose the property or not, like that.
Yeah, I think it seems reasonable. I know that in the ASN code we would have used this, but we can't because we're at standard, and presumably this is netcore.
So is there any reason? I mean, I know that we expose ASCII encoding and UTF, Unicode encoding, I think, as dedicated types. Like, did we just do this because we didn't know better in V1, or is there actually scenarios where you want to use them directly?
You can, when you instantiate things like UTF-8 encoding, you can pass in parameters that control things like whether the byte order mark is emitted. Latin1 encoding doesn't really have such a concept. So there's no need to configure the encoding in that fashion. So because there's no need to pass in a constructor parameter, there's no need for a constructor, which follows there's no need for a type.
Yeah.
I'm drawing lots of, like, I'm jumping quite a bit here, but no one's asking for the type right now. People are just asking for, how do I do this? And because there's no accelerator, they don't know how to do it.
Yeah, and anybody asking for type parameters, they should use GetEncoding at that time.
Yeah.
Yeah,
there are options that you can pass into encoding.getEncoding that control things like what happens when you encounter bad data. And those calls will continue to be honored even when this goes public.
That makes sense. Right, then
Got through all of my issues in 35 minutes.
Well, we just walk all this to newest. You just were lucky.
Oh yeah.
So it's not that
Oh,
I
yeah.
have a preference.
For what it's worth, in MySQL character sets, they call it Latin 1, not ISO 8859.
Yeah, I was about to say that. Like, that's how I know about Latin 1 is because that's what SQL Server is using.
Yeah. So I think in SQL land, Latin 1 is the name, and the ISO name is not one that people know.
Yeah, and I think in our documentation we would explicitly clarify what we mean by Latin 1, just to remove all ambiguity.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right, so I think that's it for today, and then we will continue on Thursday. I think we have, how many more we have? Let me just hit refresh here. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more issues that are marked blocking. And then maybe we can even take a look at the backlog. Maybe.
Ooh.
I know, we keep saying that, but
we'll get there one day.
One day. All right. Thanks, friends. See you later.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Emma.